John? Oh, thank you. John, it's been noted by many people that the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, has been astonishingly unsupportive of Pope Francis. And it's the only major bishops' conference that didn't put out any kind of document when Francis wrote Laudato Si on the environment. And there have been major voices, in terms of the current question about immigration, there have been major individual voices, Blaise Supe of Chicago, Bob McGreevy, who's the incoming Archbishop of Washington, have spoken strongly about how morally problematic it is just to run this up. How do you read the silence of the USCCB and its lack of support for Francis's democratic concern?
You know, that'd be worthy of a long discussion, and you know this history as well as I do, and other people in this room do too. You know, it's been I mentioned two causes here. One has been, I think, the poisonous intersection of the abortion issue with contemporary partisan politics in the United States. We are the only country in Europe and North America where the abortion issue rapidly and unpredictably became politicized in the 1970s and 1980s. That is, if we could fly back to 1972 and we went to the Democratic Party convention and the Republican Party convention, we would not know, I guarantee this, which party was more sympathetic to abortion rights or more pro-choice or more pro-life. You would not know. It's sorted out over the next decade with the Republican Party as more pro-life and the Democratic Party as more pro-choice, and we have lived with that politicization ever since. That's one reason for a generation of bishops educated in that world who feel sincerely and powerfully that the pro-life cause is a cause of social justice and needs to be defended, that it is hard for them to move into the world of Pope Francis, where abortion is one among a cluster of issues, as Francis continually says. I think that's one reason. Related to that, it's not just the abortion issue, our deep divisions within the Bishops' Conference. It is, you know, the high point of kind of unity and acting as a body was the 1980s. And we are a long way from that. A lot of the divisions in our society exist within the Bishops' Conference. So those are two related causes that I think has made the American hierarchy more cautious on a cluster of issues, not just the democratic crisis, but certainly on the democratic crisis. Yes?
My name is Warren. I'm a long time ago, Mark Bassett was one of my professors. I understand what you meant. I'm going to get sure. No problem. I understand what you meant when you said that the Catholic response to this regime in the United States has been muted. So I'm not misunderstanding you, but in some ways it really hasn't been muted. The New York Times had a piece a couple of weeks ago where they talked about the leading theorists who are supporting the idea of a unitary executive, who are supporting the idea that the President of the United States is not bound to follow whatever it is that the judiciary says. There were 9 people mentioned in the article, 7 of them were Catholic. I know you know some of them. One of them was Mormon and one of them I could not determine. And I don't want to sound like Theodore Parker from the 19th century, you know, the big fear of Catholic involvement in politics, but I am trying to find out, does that matter? And if so, how does it matter? Is their support of a unitary executive a manifestation of the democratic impulse in Catholicism or the authoritarian impulse in Catholicism?
That's such a great question, and there'd be a lot to say about that. What I might slightly reframe it and step back and say, this movement that one can read about called Inauguralism, the idea, which has as one dimension maybe a unitary executive theory, but it's actually sort of broader than that. You know, has some non-trivial Catholic roots. It's not just the individuals. You know, one at Dean is on our faculty, if I think about some friend and a colleague. It is a movement that's quite sympathetic to broadly what I would call populist nationalism, which not just in the United States, but most powerful in the United States, is one of the dominant political facts of our era. Why is it broadly sympathetic? It's scornful of secular elites, for lack of a better term. It is protective of, in its own self-understanding, of working class interests. It is protective of traditional notions of the family, which its exponents would think are being diminished for not good outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So there are genuine Catholic roots to that.
Big on localism too.
Big on localism, which works oddly with the unitary executive, theory. And so that movement is out there. It is not, I think, a popular movement. It is genuinely intellectuals. Sometimes I've given this talk 2 or 3 times, and people are, well, is that the new Maritain? And that kind of puts a pit in my stomach thinking that. But I don't think so. My own views, I'm not sure how long lasting this will be. But I say that with caution. I was certainly not the person who predicted President Trump would be elected and then re-elected. And a couple of the people in that integralism movement, again, really a movement of intellectuals, are very close to J.D. Vance, who's also a convert to Catholicism. So stay tuned on that. I take the point of the question, though. It would be really, maybe if I give different versions of talk, I should integrate that a little bit.
Hello, John. I'll have a question. It'll be about economics.
Yep.
But first, a comment and to say thank you for renewing appreciation of Jacques Maritain, who, and I say that as a student who worked for many years in the Notre Dame libraries there in theology, and was taught to kind of dismiss Maritain as a Thomist.
Yes.
These are our Thomists on the Medieval Institute on the 7th
Right.
floor. Where was it? The Maritain Center had a remnant. Was it on the 8th floor, or was it still across, just down the hall on the 7th? I forget.
Seventh.
Right? 7th. It was right down. It was right next door.
Yeah.
But it's sort of hollowed out, right? And,
Yeah, yeah.
and Maritain was dismissed as a Thomist. So thank you for kind of bringing him back and his important contributions.
Just to stay there for a second.
Sure.
He's an amazing figure. Now, we are not going to descend into the nuances of this Thomism or that Thomism before a public audience here at Boston College. That would be imprudent. But, and I'm not equipped to do that. But in terms of aesthetics, he inspired a lot of writers and artists and a whole range of people in the 50s. In terms of politics, in terms of the trajectory of his own life, which is very moving and also baffling. Like he was, at the end, he was very sad about the outcome of the Second Vatican Council, which he had done so much to develop because he thought it had moved too far too fast. So all which is to say, we are awaiting, maybe you will write it, a great biography of Maritain. I've been in the Maritain papers in Strasbourg. They're massive, and we need someone to reconceptualize him as one of the most important thinkers. I absolutely believe this of the 20th century.
Really?
Yeah.
So again, that's right. So
Yeah.
France and then Europe and then coming to America is hugely
Yes.
influential here in his time. And maybe Kathleen and others can come on more. Why was it that he became so marginalized after the Second Vatican
Yes.
Council? Was it because of different interpretations of Thomism and where they were slanted? But we'll stay away from that, okay?
Okay.
But first appreciation for bringing him back into the conversation in important ways. So the question would be about economics, I say, right? So your argument is largely around the political, social lines, right, between democracy and authoritarian governments. But what about capitalism and call it socialism, and embracing also communism as well, the kind of distribution of wealth and how that happens and how that aligns around political systems and the movement of Catholics, particularly in the United States, but probably in other parts of the world as well. You're getting the question that's behind this.
Yeah,
right? So,
there again, so much to say in that question. And Jim Conan from Boston College is in this audience, has written about American socialism. What I would broadly say, in the late 19th century, there are a couple main strands of criticism of what are coming to be called free market economics or economic liberalism as is defined by legislation. One is socialist, and a variant on that is communist. One, I believe, is Catholic, and both shaped a lot of work in Europe and Latin America to a lesser degree on both counts in the United States for various reasons. American political parties were already developed, Democratic Republic, but nonetheless important everywhere. And that Catholic theme of deep belief in private property, but also real questions about the extent to which the market should determine familial relations and should determine, in even the very early days, the rights of companies to move from communities, a whole range of things. That theme is persistent. What has struck me doing this essay, and then this is a little part of the book too, was the absence of talk about democracy. That is, in the late 19th century, Catholics are early, from the very beginning. A number of them knew Marx in Germany in the 1840s. There was a little debate between Marx and this Bishop Kepler. From the very beginning, some questioning of capitalist economies as they're emerging in the second form of industrialization, but almost no theoretical reflection on Catholicism and democracy. And that's what I think led to the tragedy of the 20s and 30s, when there was, in a lot of different countries, not much resistance among Catholics to moving from democratic to authoritarian governments. And that, because democracy was the dog that did not bark. And even this guy Salazar, who's the dictator of Portugal for about 40 years, he's a kind of a rare novarum, at least in the abstract, vision of, there's a great new book actually about the Portuguese economy, believe it or not, in this period by a woman in Penn. And she sees that Catholic connection, even though he's utterly uninterested in democracy. That's the tragedy I'm trying to get at. You're alluding to Catholic support for free market economics too, and even Friedrich von Hayek and other figures like that. And we're learning more about that. That's deeper than I thought. There's a couple of great new books on that topic, but it's still a minor tributary, I think, compared to the stream of limits on private property, support for trade unions, questioning about the rights of corporations versus the rights of communities. The Irish Constitution in 1937, which is written by a bunch of Jesuits, has a kind of offensive phrase, which people always highlight, which I share. It says, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, the ideal is when women are in the home and not in the workforce. It's in the Constitution, okay? But it also has something along the lines of, the market is not supreme. We need real checks on the market to preserve the Ireland that we want in the 20th century. So it's those two streams exist, but the one is much bigger than the other. Yes.
Thank you. My name is McGreevy, and I'm the Burns Visiting Scholar in Irish Studies this year. Christian is my host. I enjoyed the talk very much. And the phrase in the Constitution is, the state will recognise the special contribution women make through her duties in the home.
Yes.
So it gets commonly paraphrased in the way that you've said, but it's a bit more subtle than that.
Yeah.
But that's just a comment.
That's a very nice point. Thank you.
Yeah. I found your talk really thought-provoking, and I was going to ask you about the kind of line of criticism around Catholic Christian democracy as represented through the European Union, encapsulate, this criticism voiced by somebody like Ian Paisley, who views the European community as the tool of the Catholic Church, the Antichrist, as he calls it, as a means of instituting a one world government. But I won't ask you about that. What I want to ask you about instead.
Maritain, by the way, early advocate of one world government. Now that was a movement in the early 50s, but Maritain was one of the people who thought that was great.
So maybe Paisley was onto something. But
Yeah,
anyway,
he was.
my question is about Spain and the Spanish Civil War, and that moment, which seems to me to be really important in framing how Catholics around the world thought about democracy in a really challenging way, where you had, the democratically elected government, the Republican government, who embark on an incredibly bloody campaign against Catholic ordained clerics and nuns. I have a colleague, Mary Vincent in Sheffield, who's writing about the really extreme religious violence that was waged in the Catholics or in the Spanish Civil War. And then of course you have the Franco government, which comes in, wins the Civil War, institutes a bloody campaign of its own, but safeguards the position of the Catholic Church. So I was wondering how the Spanish Civil War fits into this schema that you've set out in the 20s and 30s around this tension between democracy and authoritarianism, and the safeguarding of the church and the people of the church, as well as the institutions of the church in the midst of all of that.
It's such a great question, and you're absolutely right. The only thing I would add is it's not just, and Spain is pivotal, hugely important, where Catholics and liberals simply cannot see each other. Liberals can't believe Catholics are supporting Franco. Catholics can't believe anyone would support a liberal government that does unleash a truly violent and destructive persecution of churches, priests, Catholic institutions, etc. It's not just Spain, though. It's Mexico in the 1920s, and it's the Soviet Union. And so Mexico, again, is an example for Catholics of a democratic, liberal, but profoundly anti-clerical government that is going to persecute the church. So they are equating Spain in the 30s and Mexico in the 20s. And they're looking at the Soviet Union. There, whatever, I have in the book the numbers, but there are 1,300 Catholic parishes in the Soviet Union in like 1926. There's one by 1936. And now the Soviet Union is not a democratic government, but it is, in the Catholic view, another kind of government that is out there to persecute the church. And so should we be surprised that the Catholicism of the mid-1930s is profoundly anti-communist, profoundly anti-communist? It's really hard to exaggerate that, although there are people trying to bridge the gap, and deeply skeptical of the virtues of democratic politics, because what they see in their prism is Mexico, it is Spain, and they remember the 1870s. So when the bishops in Germany, talk about the Concordat that is signed between Pius XI and the newly installed Nazi government, some of them are not happy with it. They think it's a mistake. But they all are saying we don't want a repeat of the Kulturkampf of the 1870s, when thousands of churches were destroyed, thousands of priests and nuns were forced to leave Germany. It really was an attack on the church by a liberal government. And they're thinking, well, at least we won't have that. Much worse was to come. I'm agreeing with your question, just saying that I think you can even expand it from Spain to Mexico.
Thanks for a great talk, John, and we'll give you, following Mark and more, I guess, the first two questions. I came in here with a question about our moment, and I'll give another one, and you can choose which one you want to take on. The question that I had walking in here is, given our vice president's thoughts about the ordering of love and all the moment that we're living through, I wonder if there's a kind of genealogy, an intellectual genealogy in the American context of a kind of Catholic variant of America First, kind of closing down or misreading some possible thoughts on the Catholic tradition. The second is just thinking about all the work and how your writing has taught me about American Catholic history, especially Catholicism and American freedom. I point to the way in which you've got a great frame, have had for decades, a great frame where you could teach the history of American Catholicism in your sleep. And you've got beginning, middle, end, the arc of it all. What are the highlights? What are the key characters? I wonder, doing this study, if we were to throw you after that Sunday meeting into putting together a syllabus for the introduction to American Catholic history from the beginning to the end, how does that course look a little different now, given the last 5 years of work on this? Take either of them.
I'll take the second one first. So I never had this experience, I've been an academic for a long time, where David knows I was a dean for 10 years. I did some teaching, not a lot. But there were 4 years between I was dean and I was provost. And so this is when I wrote this book. This is my pandemic. I was in the library all the time, but I was also teaching. Notre was pretty much open. And I taught a course called Global Catholicism. I probably wouldn't go back to teaching Intro to American Catholicism, which I've taught and loved, because I became so interested in the global Catholic thing. And there the question for me became, how does the U.S. fit into the global Catholic story? And I was surprised by the similarities, that the mass migration that we talk about with the U.S. story also transforms Catholicism in Brazil. It transforms it in Argentina. That is the 60 million people who leave Europe between 1814 and 1914. It's a global phenomenon. There are American dimensions to it, but it's a global phenomenon. And most things in American Catholic history, I now believe, I'm a partisan in global history, can be viewed a little bit more in a global framework. To get your first question, the last 20 years are more of an argument for American exceptionalism. I don't think what's happening in the U.S. Has much, that is, the intersection of partisan politics with different kinds of Catholicism. The fact that when we meet someone and talk to them and learn that they're Catholic, we can sometimes kind of predict their political and religious views just from half an hour of conversation. I think that's pretty distinctive to the United States. That's not true in Canada, that's not true in Britain, that's not true in a lot of other places. So that overlap of religious and political partisan identification that we live with, that's pretty new and pretty different. Yes?
So I have a question based off of the second or third question about, in your history or your vision, how should Catholics think about the relation between democracy and liberalism? So I think it was a way to read maybe some 20th century figures like De Lubac that were trying to develop a political theology that's not liberal, more totalitarian, and show how should that history inform debates on democracy today. And then second question is unrelated, that's fine, but I've heard a lot of people criticize the Holy See's deal with this with China, the CCP, and so on sort of these democratic grounds. And so I'm curious, how does it factor in to your history and how you do these things?
So that first one's a big one. We can't stay here long enough for democracy and liberalism. And I don't claim deep expertise here, but what I like about the question is it doesn't assume they're the same thing. Okay, I would call Pope Francis a Democrat, but not a liberal. He's not a conventional liberal in the American sense. He's coming out of the Latin American context. He has different priorities, different ideas. He's all in on democracy. And you know, if you read the speech he gave in Athens, it's actually quite powerful, I think. I don't know if he drafted it or if people around him drafted it, but it's a powerful speech. But he is not a conventional John Rawls style or even American style liberal. He is a different, coming out of a different tradition altogether. Okay, so that's an important distinction to make. What was the second question?
The Chinese deal.
Oh yeah. I mean, listen, John McGreevy, citizen and Catholic, doesn't think that's a good idea. I think they're making a mistake by, I don't know any inside story here. There are people who know a lot more than I do about this, but long term, I mean, here's a twist for you, right? In the 1930s, it was the liberal Catholics, Maritain among them, who were appalled by the Concordat with Nazi Germany. Okay, you can say it's defensive and you're just trying to protect Catholic institutions, but you are diminishing the church by negotiating at all with a government like that. And conservatives said, listen, our job is to protect the church. And if you can do that, you know, and really there weren't people, well, there were people in Germany, but there weren't really people outside of Germany defending the Nazi government, Catholics. But they were saying, prudentially, we should negotiate with this government that's in power, and we should try and protect probably the country in the world with the highest density of Catholic institutions. And the Concordat was aimed at protecting those institutions. Fast forward to China in the last 15 years. The liberals say we should negotiate with China. China is one of the world's biggest countries, it has the biggest economy. There are over 100 million Catholics in China, which is a small percentage of Catholics, or 10 million, sorry, I exaggerated there. Something like 10 million Catholics in China, not a huge number for other Catholic countries, but a lot of people nonetheless. And we should negotiate and try and protect those Catholics and even those few Catholic institutions that are pretty independent of the party in a country where there aren't many independent institutions. And the conservatives say, no dealing with Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. There's no distinction between the state and civil society in China. We shouldn't be even having this conversation. I have to say on that point, I lean a little bit toward the conservatives, but there are probably people in this audience who know more about it than I do. Okay, I've exhausted you. Thank you for your patience, and it's great to be here.